They said she consorted with demons, that her voice summoned darkness, that her silence meant guilt. But all she did was speak to a cat, not in ritual, not in madness, just softly as one might speak to the wind, to memory, to loneliness. And for that, they dragged her through the streets, bound her hands, tied her to fire, because in a world ruled by fear, even tenderness can be seen as treason. This is not a fairy tale. This is how they killed a woman, for being too gentle with something the church could not control. They called her Isabeau. She was born not screaming, but watching, eyes too wide, too still, as if she had arrived not from a mother's womb, but from another time entirely. Her village whispered that she was different, the kind of child who didn't cry when the wind howled or when the dogs barked at night, the kind who stared too long at the stars as if reading something no one else could see. She was raised in a house of wool and wood, where her mother spun and her father drank. Her brothers didn't speak to her much. They didn't need to. She made people uncomfortable without trying. There was something too quiet about her, too careful, as if she'd been taught the world was a mirror, and if you moved too suddenly it might crack. So she moved slowly. She picked herbs others didn't know the names of. She spoke softly to the wind. She hummed old tunes no one remembered teaching her. And then there was the cat. He was black, of course, not because stories demand it, but because fate has a sense of drama. He arrived one evening just as the sun was bleeding out across the fields, thin, watchful, the kind of creature no one noticed, except her. She didn't name him, she simply let him in. He stayed. They didn't speak, not at first. It was just a presence, a rhythm, a silent agreement between two beings who understood that the world had sharp teeth and little patience for softness. She fed him from her own bowl, let him sleep by her feet. And when she cried at night, which was rare, he pressed his small body against hers as if to say, "I know." People began to notice. And in a village like hers, noticing is a dangerous thing. They said she didn't attend Mass enough, that she wandered the woods too often, that her eyes were too green, too knowing, too old. A neighbor swore she saw Isabeau whispering into the cat's ear and the cat nodding. Another claimed the harvest died after Isabeau walked through the barley. A midwife insisted the girl's breath had turned warm milk sour. It didn't matter that none of it was true. What mattered was that it could be. What mattered was that she had no husband, no priest, no one to vouch for her purity. What mattered was that she made people feel something they couldn't name. And what they couldn't name, they learned to fear. She was 17 when they came for her. No trial, no priest. Just 3 men with ropes in hands that shook, not from doubt, but from the weight of what they knew they were about to do. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply placed the cat gently outside the door and whispered something no one else heard. Then she let them take her, because she already understood something most people never do, that truth doesn't save you from fire. They locked her in a cellar below the chapel. Damp stone, iron chains, a single slit of light that moved like a blade across the floor. They asked questions that weren't questions. They recited verses not to cleanse her, but to convince themselves. They named her things she didn't recognize. Witch, temptress, heretic, liar. She didn't answer, not because she had nothing to say, because they weren't asking out of curiosity. They were asking for permission to destroy her and feel righteous doing it. The bishop came. His robes were crimson, his voice was velvet dipped in poison. He didn't look her in the eye. He called her child, then beast, then empty vessel. He asked her what she said to the cat. She smiled, just faintly, and that was enough. Because nothing frightens a man of power more than a woman who smiles when she is supposed to beg. They didn't burn her right away. They needed to gather the town. They needed the performance. Because executions were not about guilt. They were about order. And nothing restores order like a woman-made example. The night before the burning, the cat returned. No one saw how he entered. He simply appeared in her cell, pressing his face to her bruised hands, purring so softly it felt like a prayer. She whispered again. Not a spell, a memory, a thank you, a farewell. At dawn they led her through the square. She was barefoot. She did not cry. The crowd waited, as they always did, for the part where fear would show itself. In her eyes, in her knees, in her breath. It never came. Instead, she looked into the crowd and said one thing. If you fear what loves you silently, what does that say of your God? Then she closed her eyes, and the fire was lit. The cat did not leave. He sat at the edge of the square until the ashes fell like snow. They said he disappeared after that. Some say he wandered into the woods and became a shadow. Others say he still visits women who speak softly and walk alone. But the truth is simpler. He outlived her. Because love that asks for nothing is often what power destroys first. They built the pyre like they were building a monument. Each piece of wood placed with sacred calculation. Each rope tied with practiced precision. This wasn't punishment. It was theater. A stage for fear to be reaffirmed, for certainty to be relit in the hearts of men who had long since forgotten what it was they feared. It had rained the night before, but the wood burned anyway. They made sure of that. The executioner's hands didn't tremble. They rarely do. Not because they are brave, but because they no longer imagine who they're killing. They only see the shape, the body, the function. And she, Isabeau, was function now, a warning dressed in flesh. The bishop gave a sermon as the flames rose. His voice boomed across the square like judgment itself. He spoke of purity, of sin, of darkness wearing the face of innocence. But his eyes never left her, because he needed her to break. He needed her to scream, to curse, to collapse into the archetype they'd written for her. But she didn't. She simply stood, bound, her head tilted back, not in defiance, but in witness, as if she were not being burned, but watching something else burn down around her, something no one else could see. The crowd was restless. Some wept, some cheered. Most stood silent, because silence in such moments feels like safety. The fire took her slowly. Witches must suffer. That's the rule. A clean death is for the innocent. But women who speak to cats must be devoured. And yet even then, as her flesh blackened and curled, she did not scream. She simply vanished, as if her body remembered how to become wind. Afterward, the bishop declared the village cleansed. He walked through the streets as though blessing each stone with his passing. He wore his triumph like a halo. He believed that what had been burned would remain burned, that fire erases. But fire remembers, and wood once scorched never forgets the heat. They buried the ashes outside the cemetery wall, unmarked, unblessed. Because that's what you do with sin that won't confess. And for a time it seemed to work. The fields yielded crops again. The animals bred. The sick recovered. The balance had been restored. But at night there were whispers. In kitchens. In stables. Among women who had known Isabeau, not well, but enough to wonder. They spoke of her hands. How gentle they were. Of how she sang while gathering herbs. Of how the cat never scratched, never hissed, only listened. And slowly suspicion began to crack. Not suspicion of her, but of themselves. Because they had watched her burn, and they had said nothing. And something inside them had died with her. The baker's wife started leaving food out at night near the woods. The midwife stopped attending mass. A child, no one knows whose, was seen speaking to a gray cat under the old well. The bishop noticed. He tried to tighten the rituals. More sermons, more fasting. He said the fire had not burned deep enough, that the evil was still among them. But the people had seen what evil truly looked like, and it wore robes. It spoke with confidence. It demanded submission, not understanding, and it killed tenderness when it could not control it. Still they obeyed, outwardly. But something shifted, not loudly, not in rebellion, in stillness, in the kind of silence that does not fear but waits. The bishop died 3 winters later. They say he slipped in the chapel, cracked his skull on the altar. Others say the cat tripped him. But there were no witnesses. Only a small black paw print burned into the velvet of his vestments. They buried him with ceremony. But no one wept. No one sang. The fire he had kindled in others had not gone out. It had turned into a slow, glowing memory. Not of him. Of her. Years passed. Children played in the square where the pyre once stood. Mothers warned them not to stay out after dark. Not because of witches, but because of truth. Because truth has teeth, and it comes for those who silence it. And sometimes it wears fur, and walks on quiet feet, and listens. Just like she did. And the cat? He still came. Not often. Not predictably. But just enough to remind the world that what they burned wasn't evil. It was a woman who refused to be afraid. And in the shadow of that refusal, a new kind of fire began to grow. They never spoke her name again. Not because they forgot it, but because they knew that to speak it was to admit the fire hadn't worked. It is easier to erase than to repent, easier to silence than to remember, easier to fear than to understand. And so they did what people always do when they sense they have killed something sacred. They built stories, not about her, but about evil, about the devil's mark, about shadows that slipped under doorways at night, about witches who whispered to beasts and made milk curdle and wombs dry. They taught these stories to their children, to keep them safe, they said. But what they were really doing was burying guilt under folklore, because if Isabeau had been evil, then they were not monsters. They were heroes, and if she had truly spoken with the devil, then burning her had been necessary, even merciful. So the lie became scripture, and truth a ghost. But ghosts do not sleep forever, and guilt, like blood, leaves a stain that seeps through even the thickest theology. It began with the dreams. The seamstress swore she saw Isabeau in her sleep, hands unburned, hair full of leaves, cradling a black cat in her lap. She didn't speak, she simply looked, and when the seamstress awoke, her thread had turned red. A child fell ill, feverish, sweating, muttering words in a language no one recognized. The priest was called, the crucifix was raised, but the child screamed, not in fear but in grief. They burned her, he said, and she forgave them. A cow refused to give milk. A lantern exploded for no reason. Bread rose too quickly. Little things, unprovable, unconnected. But in the town's collective imagination, a pattern emerged. They said the witch was returning. They said she had cursed them from the ashes. They said she would not rest until all were punished. But they were wrong. Isabeau had no interest in revenge. She had never wanted to harm. All she ever wanted was to live quietly, to speak without being questioned, to love something small and warm and alive. What returned was not her spirit. It was her absence. The shape of her burned into the air like a scent that never fully fades. And it began to change the village. Slowly, quietly. A woman who had once mocked Isabeau began tending to strays. The baker's daughter planted lavender where the pyre once stood. A widow who had cheered during the burning stopped speaking altogether. Not out of fear, out of recognition. They saw now what they had been part of. Not a cleansing, a silencing. And in that realization, a strange thing happened. They began to listen again. To the forest. To the wind. To the soft noises that animals make when they think no one hears. They began to speak gently, to pause before judging, to wonder what else they had been wrong about. It wasn't a revolution. No torches. No banners. Just a soft unlearning. A slow return to something older than doctrine. Instinct. Compassion. Curiosity. But not everyone welcomed the shift. A new priest arrived. Younger, sharper, eyes like frozen wells. He spoke with certainty, as young men often do. He called the cat a demon, declared the lavender unholy, said the dreams were temptation. He preached louder, fasted harder, sprinkled more holy water. But the pews stayed empty. The people were tired, not of faith, but of fear. They had tasted something deeper, and once tasted, it cannot be untasted. The priest tried one last thing. He ordered the old records burned, the ledgers, the confessions, the names. Erasure once again, posing as salvation. But before the fire reached them, a girl, barely 12, slipped in and stole a page. She didn't know why, only that it felt important. She hid it in her skirt, beneath the waistband, warm against her skin. It was a list of witnesses, people who had testified against Isabeau. At the bottom, in shaky ink, her eyes were too green to be innocent. The girl read it again and again. She had green eyes, and she was tired of being afraid of them. That night she lit a single candle, and whispered to the shadows, not in Latin, not in fear, in love. She whispered, "You deserved better." The wind stirred. The cat appeared on her windowsill. She opened the glass, let him in. He curled beside her and purred, and the girl smiled, not because she believed in witches, but because she believed in the listening. And something, somewhere, had finally started to listen back. He was never given a name, no bell around his neck, no collar, no mark of ownership, and maybe that was the point. He belonged to no one. He was not a pet, not a demon, not a symbol. He was simply there, when the world turned cruel and the voices went quiet. He had sat beside Isabeau when the door closed behind the men. He had waited outside the chapel walls as her screams failed to come. He had watched the sky turn red and gray and black as they tied her hands and called it mercy. And still he did not run. He returned to the place they called sacred and curled up where her feet once touched stone. People feared him. Then they mocked him. Then they ignored him. But he did not leave. They fed him scraps in the alley, not out of kindness, but superstition. Because every time someone threw him out, something broke. A roof caved in. A child sickened. A voice was lost mid-song. So he stayed. Through seasons. Through sermons. Through generations. And though the fur grayed and the eyes dulled, the presence remained sharp. He was more than memory. He was consequence. When girls cried in silence, he came to their window. When women stitched secrets into their hems, he watched from the beams above. When someone was about to be taken by force, by shame, by silence, he would appear, not to fight, but to remind that someone once had not survived, and the world had let it happen. The stories changed. Now they said the cat was the witch, or at least what was left of her. They said her spirit had entered him at the pyre, that his paws carried her will, that his tail could draw circles of fire. Children dared each other to touch him, to speak to him. Most didn't. Because when he looked at you, you saw yourself. Not as you appeared, but as you were. He saw the lies you had swallowed, the things you had buried to keep your place at the table. And for a moment, you remembered that fear is not always proof of danger. Sometimes it's a map to something sacred. One woman, old now, spine curved like a question mark, kept a bowl of cream outside her door every night. She said he came at midnight and left by dawn. She never saw him. But her dreams grew softer. Another girl, maybe 15, maybe younger, stopped speaking for weeks after her uncle died suddenly. People called it grief. But her mother found claw marks on the windowsill, and in her daughter's pillow, a single black whisker. A new midwife moved into the village. She was plain, stern, and had no time for stories. She tried to shoo the cat from her doorstep. The next morning her herbs had withered. Her hands, which had delivered life for 20 years, began to shake. She left quietly and never spoke of it again. The priest tried once more to trap him, laid snares with holy salt, read aloud from forbidden texts, swore he saw the cat vanish into air. But what really vanished was certainty, because each time he failed, the village remembered this wasn't a curse. It was a choice. To listen, or to burn. One girl, born the spring the bishop died, followed the cat for 7 nights. He led her through woods, past forgotten stones to a clearing. There in moonlight she saw it. Not a grave, not a shrine, just a place where silence hummed, and lavender grew wild despite the frost. She knelt, not in worship, in recognition. She did not ask for power. She did not ask for love. She asked to remember. The cat blinked once, turned, and vanished. She returned to the village different, not magical, not marked, just less afraid. And in a world like this, that is the rarest kind of miracle. No one ever built a statue for Isabeau. No plaque. No chapel window. Just stories, passed from hands that knew how to hold pain gently, whispers that knew the difference between superstition and survival, and a cat who never left. Because some spirits do not seek rest. They seek witness. By the time 100 winters had passed, they had stopped calling her a witch. Not because they no longer feared her, but because they feared what the word revealed about themselves. They called her a lesson instead. A mistake. An unfortunate moment in their otherwise civilized history. They spoke of her in hushed historical tones, detached, sterilized, written into the margins of books no one read. The fire was described, but not the hands that lit it. Her name was footnoted, her death contextualized. They blamed the times, the superstition, the church, the people, everything but the impulse itself. Because to truly remember, Isabeau would be to remember how ordinary it all was. How simple it is to erase a woman when she becomes inconvenient. How easy it is to destroy what doesn't bow. They turned her into a tale for academics, a symbol for lectures, a moment used to prove how far they'd come. But history never forgets what it's forced to digest, and neither did the village, because something about her stayed in the bones of the place, in the way the wind moved around the chapel, in the silence that followed every sermon, in the way women passed recipes by whisper and instinct, not script. It was said the lavender that grew where she was burned never wilted, that cats slept near it in the spring, curling their bodies around the purple stalks like guardians. The new priest was different. He smiled more, spoke softly. He came from far away, and perhaps that was why he saw the place differently, or perhaps it was because his mother had once been tried for sorcery and had survived only by marrying quickly and forgetting herself completely. He found the church cold and lit more candles. He found the villages distant and listened more than he spoke. And one evening, after a long walk, he stopped by the lavender patch and simply sat. The cat came. The priest offered no fear, no gesture of power, just presence, and that, at last, was enough. He was the first to speak her name aloud in years, not in judgment, in grief. "Isabeau," he said, "I am sorry." And the wind shifted. Not with violence, with recognition. He began to speak of her in homilies, not as a witch, as a woman, a healer, a question no one had been brave enough to answer. He didn't ask the villagers to believe. He asked them to remember. Some left the church, some returned, but everyone began to feel the tension that had been hanging in the air for a century loosen. Not release, not disappear, just loosen, like the top button on a too-tight collar. Children began asking her name again, not as a curse, as a curiosity. Who was she? Why did she die? What did she really say to the cat? One child guessed maybe she told him a joke. Another said, maybe she asked him to stay. And a third, smaller voice said, maybe she asked him to remember. The village elder, a woman whose eyes had outlived every man who ever tried to silence her, smiled. She had once been told her green eyes were dangerous. She had once dreamt of fire. Whoa. She had once seen a black cat sleeping in the ruins of the old chapel and had felt, for the first time, that the world might yet be kind. She said nothing. She simply placed a small, carved figure of a cat on her windowsill that evening and whispered a name the wind still carried. They never rebuilt the pyre. They let the ground take it back. Grass grew wild there, and when the sun fell just right, the shadows made the shape of a woman standing tall. Not burning, not begging. Simply there, witnessed. Some say the cat still returns every spring, that if you listen closely, you can hear her voice in his purr. Not magic. Not madness. Just memory that will not go quiet. There are stories that fade, like old parchment left in the sun, and then there are stories that rot beneath the floorboards, pulsing with the lives they never had permission to finish. Isabeau's story was neither. Hers was a scar, not loud, not bleeding, but always there. Beneath the paint, beneath the doctrine, beneath the years. The village never officially rewrote her death. There was no monument, no apology, no ceremony of undoing. But things changed. Not suddenly, not publicly. In the quiet where all real revolutions begin. Women stopped apologizing for walking alone. Cats were no longer kicked from the doorways. Herbs once banned were grown again in gardens. Not because anyone gave permission, but because no one asked anymore. And there were other signs. A mother who named her daughter Isabeau and dared anyone to flinch. A teacher who taught both the Lord's Prayer and the names of the local trees. A girl who laughed loudly in the chapel and wasn't shushed. The cat came less often. He wasn't needed as much. But every few years he returned. Not to haunt. To check. To be sure the silence hadn't taken root again. And when he curled in the shade of the lavender patch, he looked old. Not tired. Just ready? As if his long watch might finally be ending. Some say he died there. Others say he turned into wind. But the old woman, green-eyed, always listening, said no. She said he had finished what he was asked to do, and now he slept finally without keeping one ear open. The children grew up with the story. But it was different now. Not a tale of fire. A tale of voice. Of what it means to speak in a world that punishes speaking. Of what it means to love something no one else understands. Of what it means to refuse to perform fear. Isabeau was not remembered for being burned. She was remembered for never begging to be spared, and in that, she became something more dangerous than any curse. She became a possibility. That you could live without kneeling. That you could love without permission. That you could speak softly to something small, and be answered. Her story was no longer told in the square. It was passed between fingers, over bread, through braids and lullabies. She was the breath in a sleeping child's hair. The silence before a girl says no for the first time. The steady purr beside a woman who knows she doesn't need to be saved. The fire had tried to erase her, but all it did was carve her deeper. And now, whenever the lavender blooms, whenever a black cat crosses a path without shame, whenever a woman lifts her eyes and refuses to look down, Isabeau lives again. Not as ghost, not as legend, but as reminder that what they fear most is the woman who speaks gently and is not afraid to be heard.